Jambo Rafiki, I'm Elizabeth from Kasiwa82 and I hope you are doing really well. If you're new to my channel, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back. I post 2 videos a week. On Tuesdays, I talk about all things books, and on Fridays, I talk about all things journals and creative play. What I'm going to do today is talk about the 3 books I read for the Invisible Cities project for January. I will leave a link to that particular project and all the hosts who are running it on the various platforms down below. So I encourage you to go take a look at that. Now, the reason this project excites me is I read quite a fair amount of translated fiction and nonfiction. But when I took a look at last year's translated works, or works in translation, I found that the majority of my works in translation were actually Japanese because I was reading a whole bunch of manga series last year. I read and completed several manga series, which were actually all really good. If you're interested in that, let me know and I'll make a video talking about the Japanese manga that I've read and loved. But what I realized is I want to read books that are not necessarily just manga and just Japanese. Even though over the course of the year, especially in August when I read, I do the Women in Translation challenge or readathon, I tend to read more translated works throughout the year, but there was very much a skew towards Japanese and manga. So what I wanted to do with this challenge is actually diversify, right? Read more works in translation from around the globe. So what I think is really fun about this project is they pick 3 countries every month. And what I'm doing is just reading 3 books from each one of those countries. That's my goal. I mean, if I get around to reading more, that's great, but I'm not putting that kind of pressure on myself. I'm like, pick 1 book for each country each month. That gives me 3 works in translation. So that gives me 36 books in translation for the year that are not just manga. So that's kind of what's the goal of this challenge is for me. So the books, the countries for January, let me just look at my Goodreads here, were Japan, Argentina, and Morocco. Interestingly enough, that's the order of books I read, so let's talk about them. For Japan, I read The Devotion of Suspect X. It is the 3rd book in the Detective Galileo series, and it is written by Keigo Higashino. I apologize for translations. I will leave the names of the books and everything down below so you can take a look at that for yourself. So this particular book is translated from the Japanese by Alexander Rose Smith, and I listened to the audiobook, which is really great, wonderfully narrated by David Pittu. So I think one of the interesting things about works in translation, whether it's books or movies or anything, is you are always on the outside looking in. So there's things you just don't get. I remember being in Turkey and watching Turkish television, and for some reason they allowed all kinds of things on the screen, right? Sex, kissing, but for some reason they kept blurring out the tips of cigarettes. And to this day, I'm not quite sure what that was about, other than discouraging people from smoking. It didn't seem to be working based on my, taking a look at the population there. But that's what I'm saying. So there's something about works in translation that always kind of feel as though you're out of your depth, that something is lost in the translation. It doesn't tend to, if you're in the Western world looking at Western literature or Western movies, for the most part, you get what's going on. But when you're not in that context, there's a lot of what is happening. And this is kind of what I felt like with this book. So this is the 3rd book, as I said, in the Detective Galileo series. And when I wanted to take a look at it, this is a highly, highly popular series in Japan. And there are 9 books, I think, in the series, of which only 3 are translated into English. So that's kind of an interesting choice as well. And this is the first English translation, although it's the 3rd book in the series. So that's one of the things here. The premise is the following. You have 2 main characters that are, I guess, going through all of these 9 books. The first one is a detective. So this is the classic, in some ways, detective story. Okay, so there's a cop, there's a detective, and then the Galileo of the title, or of the subtitles, is a brilliant physicist. So he works in a university, and these 2 people, the detective and this physicist, tend to pair up on solving murders, crimes of some kind. So when we come into this book, which is the third installation, you can tell that these two characters have worked together before because they talk about it, right? So there's references to them working on solving other cases that were mysterious or head scratching. But we haven't read that. So you get kind of that hint, but this book does really read as a standalone, but there is this sense of, boy, I would have loved to have read the other two books to kind of get more of an understanding of the dynamics of these two characters. Like, how did they meet? Why did they choose to work together? Those kinds of things just don't come up in this one because it's been covered elsewhere. However, this does read as a standalone. Now, classic detective stories or crime fiction, if you will, if you think of the Western genre, they follow a pretty formulaic system, right? They're pretty formulaic in that if you pick up one of those books, you kind of know what to expect from that particular reading. In this particular case, you start with in fairly early on in the book, there's a woman a woman and her daughter standing over a dead man that they killed. So that's not a spoiler. That happens within the first couple of sections, pages of the book. So we start with, we know who's dead, we know who killed him, we know how they did it, we know why they did it. So, okay, that's usually, the end of a Western police procedural, if you will. So I'm sitting there going, all right, now I know all the answers to all of those questions, so where is this story going to go? I mean, what are they going to tell me now? Like, where is this going? And I think what is so great and brilliant about how this story is told is the author takes those off the table. So it gives you the space to pay attention to all the other things that are going on. You're not trying to do the whodunit because you already know. So how are they going to solve this problem? So enter the neighbor of the woman and her daughter, who is a maths genius, who's basically teaching at a high school level, which is not challenging to him at all, but it gives him time to work on the problems he wants to solve, okay? And what he does is he decides to come and help this mom and daughter cover up this murder. And what ends up happening now is a cat and mouse game. It's a very complicated chess game as this math genius is trying to outwit the physics genius and the cop, and they all have a connection which will come out. But that's the interesting game you're watching, is how does he set things up, the maths guy, and what do the cops find, and what does Galileo find? And I mean, there's a scene or a reveal that happens about 3/4 or more of the book, like almost to the last several chapters of the book, that it's not a twist per se, but I couldn't believe what I had just read. I had to go back and revisit and go, oh my goodness. Highly recommend this one. It is not a thriller in the classic sense of that genre. It is not a whodunit. It really is a meditation of the characters and their motivation and how this rolls out. It also is, there's a really clear sense of place and time. Understanding and reading about some of what was happening or is happening culturally in Japan, I think, is one of the powers of this book. It really steeps you in your here, learning about all these kinds of people and who they are and what their motivation is, and kind of a scene setting, if you will, while this mystery kind of is happening in the background. I highly recommend this one. I really am delighted that I made the effort to pick this one up because it's been on my TBR for a while. And I was always hesitant because it's the third in a series. And I, like I said, except for the minor, wait a minute, how did these two guys meet in the first place? And why are they working together? This works really well as a standalone. And I really, really enjoyed it. I gave this one 4 stars. I will definitely pick up the rest in the series that we have in English translation anyway. And I know this author also has other books that are translated, so I'll definitely be looking into that. Next up, for the Argentina selection, I picked Things We Lost in the Fire. And this is by Mariana Enríquez, and it is translated by McDowell. I also listened to this on audio, wonderfully read by Tanya. Now, Things We Lost in the Fire is a short story collection, and I am not generally a fan of that genre. I'm not a short story fan. I have some that I really have loved, and I have some, for the most part, I always feel like I've invested all this time and then it ends. And I could have been, I much prefer long books. The bigger the book, if it's well written, the better as far as I'm concerned. So short stories have always kind of not really worked for me. I've gotten better at understanding how to read them in the last several years. And I think one of the things that has worked really well for me is to read one and then walk away, as opposed to read one after the other, the way you would read a normal book. So this is a collection of short stories. They are horror short stories. They are written by an Argentinian woman, and I have to say they are some of the best horror stories that I have read. They would rank right up there with some of what we would consider the best English writing short stories that I have read. They are really well written. There's this claustrophobic sense of feeling throughout every one of these stories, such that really when I got to the end of each one, there's this relief of release that comes with you get to the end of the story. There's magical realism in here. It's pretty gritty. She's talking about some of the things that are taking place in Argentina, and unlike a lot of horror stories, these have women and women's issues kind of at the core of them. And that's one of the things that I really appreciated about this collection. So as with any collection, there are some books I liked better than others. There are a couple of 5-star reads in here. I'll leave a link to my Goodreads account down below. And when I review this book on Goodreads, I actually rate each one. I give a star rating to each one of the books in this collection. But across the board, there is not one here that I was like, well, I didn't even understand what was going on there. Every one is well done. Like I said, some better than others, but the ones that are really, really good have really stayed with me. There's a story about a woman who comes home with a skull. She finds a skull, and then this obsession that she has with this skull in her house. There's a story of how women decide that they're going to handle the violence against women, and how women are going to basically take a stand, and how they take that stance. That's an image it's hard for me to let go of. Again, so each one of these stories, there are specific things in them that just really kind of get their hooks in, and I just wouldn't let go. And so highly recommend this collection. I also really recommend on audio, because like I said, a lot of the words in terms of towns and places and names and streets are all Argentinian, right? So I would have to stumble over how are those being pronounced, and having someone pronounce them correctly for you helps with the whole flow, in my opinion. Highly recommend this one. I give this one 4 stars. And finally, my selection for Morocco is Sex and Lies by Leïla Slimani, and it's translated from the French by Sophie Lewis. Now, this is the only nonfiction in these 3 books that I read for this month for Invisible Cities, and it was my least favorite. I gave this one 3 stars. So what this is nonfiction, and it's a collection of, it's kind of an oral essay collection, if you will. So the author has written a book called Adele, which caused quite a sensation in Morocco, because I'm assuming, based on what I've read, I have not read her other books, is that the main character in this story, Adele, is very sexually free. She's got no hang-ups, my understanding, okay? And so when that book gets translated and people in Morocco read it, and she goes to Morocco to do a book tour, she got a lot of requests from women who wanted to talk to her about sex in their lives. And so this is kind of this collection of, here's what the women told her, kind of a transcript of what they told her, as well as her talking to activists and professionals in the country in terms of who work in this field and where things stand to date. Okay, interspersed with that, there's a memoir element in terms of the author talking about what it was like for her to visit and talk to these women, and 2, as a Moroccan, how she herself has grappled with some of the issues that come up. So should have been excellent. I should have loved this book. And again, if this is a new concept to you, the fact that for some reason there is this obsession about women's bodies and women's sexuality by the patriarchy, and specifically the monotheistic religions, if that is a new concept, there's a lot here that I think you would find enlightening, okay, and informative. As a person who's much more familiar with that, I mean, I'm expecting to be angry based on some of these stories, and I was. But there wasn't necessarily anything new that the author covers here, other than, I think, giving a voice to the women in Morocco. I mean, because at the end of the day, even though the government and from a legal perspective has criminalized sex out of wedlock, you also have the religious aspect of that in terms of how the community handles that, right? So to me, one of the most interesting things about this book was the exploration between where the law ends and where community and social networks and social oppression and neighbors interfering in each other's lives, where that line blurs. Because even though some things are illegal, I mean, how are you really going to police that? People having sex out of wedlock, right? So there's sex out of wedlock, there's prostitution, there's homosexuality, there's abortion. Again, all these issues that for some reason seem to upset everybody. And then you have the legal system, even though the laws are on the books, not really enforcing that necessarily, unless they're enforcing it in a way that they get to get a bribe out of it so they make money. On the other hand, you have society that polices much more strongly and stringently than what the laws on the books say. Meanwhile, everybody's having sex, right? So as with all situations, things are harder for women and men who are disenfranchised in some way, whether they're poor or they're gay, or they just don't have access to have private spaces that will not be invaded or neighbors cannot see, right? Because otherwise what you have to do is you have to rent a hotel room, which they will not rent to unmarried people, or you have to have sex in a car. Well, not everybody has or can afford a car, right? So there are these layers and layers of how these issues weave with each other. And I think that comes across pretty clearly in the book. But once you get past the first couple of transcripts, if you will, you're kind of hearing the same thing repeated over and over again. So that was one of the thing that did not work as well for me. I appreciated what she's trying to do here. I appreciate the representation. I appreciate the voice. These women finally get to have a voice. That is important, of course, because, as an outsider looking in, I am not Moroccan in Morocco, right? But this is very, very similar to what you will find across, like if you look at South Asia, for example, or you look at the Middle East, even in the US, right? Some of these issues, even in the US, are issues here. So again, where the law intersects with social policing, I find very interesting. I mean, one of the things that was, I took a pause in this story, in this book was, there's this whole conversation about, where sex is quote unquote legitimized and where it's not. And that there's this scholar who's an imam who basically has this ruling that, a man can have sex with his wife even if she's a corpse, because that fits within the quote unquote, religious strictures. I mean, seriously. So yes, if you are new to these concepts, I think there's a lot you can gain from this particular book. I appreciated it for what it was. It, however, was repetitive, and I didn't get a heck of a lot more than I, in some ways, already knew. So I gave this one 3 stars. I was hoping for something more than that. But again, I'm glad I got to this one. I will definitely try this author's fictional books, because she's got a couple out that, have been on my list for a while to take a look at. I liked it enough that I will try some of the other stuff that she's written. So that was the Morocco selection. So Japan, Argentina, Morocco, right? Those are the 3 I read for January. I even with my 3-star, I highly appreciated the chance and the incentive to actually put these books into rotation from voices that otherwise might not get to my reading list, until some point further along the line. So for the next month, which is February, we have China, Colombia, and Egypt. I've already started the book from China. I started the book from Colombia. So I'm reading 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez, which has been on my list forever. Why not? And I'm interested to see what the other two selections I pick are. I'd be curious if you are playing along or reading along with this particular project, what you're finding, what you're reading, what you are loving and not loving. And if you have any recommendations for some of the countries that are upcoming, would love to hear about them, because I'm always looking for books that don't necessarily are already on my radar, right? So that's what I have for you today. Would love to know what you're reading. Would love to know if you are reading translated fiction or translated nonfiction, particularly translated nonfiction. If you have any books in that particular category in any country really that you recommend that you loved, I would love to hear about that. And until I talk to you next time, happy reading. Bye.